Hello, welcome back to Thrive Yoga Fit Transformational Coaching. This is Erin. So I hope that you had a fantastic Thanksgiving. This podcast is a little bit late. There's like a handful of times where I've gone a week without recording a podcast. It happens usually once or twice a year. So thank you for your grace. But I know that you're like so excited now to hear from me and to have all this energy built up. And I went and had Thanksgiving dinner over at my mother's last night, which was surprisingly wonderful. And she has like 10 million puppies that are always there. Well, they're not puppies, they're little dogs, but they're always just like kind of like little fluffy mops that wag their tails and give little kisses. So that's always a good time. And I went there with my partner who happens to be here today. So he is actually my guest who I'm interviewing. So hello, Mr. Matt Murphy.
Hi.
Hi. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I am well. So I thought it would be interesting to have Matt on the show. It's funny because I actually get emails from people who are like, tell Matt I said hello. And so you're maybe to a lot of people like a character in my podcast. So you've never really actually been on my podcast officially, I don't think.
Yes, I have.
Have you?
Yeah.
Oh, we did that one?
In Asheville. And another one.
Oh, that's right. Okay. All right. Well, this one is a little bit more, this one is a little bit more directed. This one is a little bit more about his experience with the sacred texts of India. And Matt's a very interesting person to listen to. And you'll see why I put up with listening to him. So let me go ahead and get started. So Matt, what got you into studying the sacred texts of India so in depth?
Somehow or another, I got a hold of the Bhagavad Gita when I was in middle school and I read it. And that's
so you're about 12 or?
Thereabouts. Yeah. I think I was in like 7th or 8th grade. So I'd already read most of the Bible by then too. And
which I found out last night just how in depth you know it.
Well, yeah, I mean, if there's an ancient story, I'm interested in it. And the Bhagavad Gita is a sacred text, and it's like kind of a philosophical treatise from several different angles. But just because it's a treatise doesn't mean it's also, or that it's not also part of a big, larger story, which it is. So I read the Bhagavad Gita, and it appealed to me in many ways, even though I'm not going to claim I understood all the content in depth at that age. But there was lots of things that popped out, and the things that did pop out were very memorable. So it started me on a path of reading lots of that material, and I never really stopped. And I just went further, wider, deeper, and tried to enjoy myself along the way. It was never really like a task. It was never some project I had to do, and it was driven by my personal interest. And it also wasn't driven by like any deep spiritual thirst or anything like that. I just admired what I read, and I wanted to read more.
That's usually not how these journeys begin, at least in my experience. You know, it's not like I came to the yoga mat for enlightenment. I came because like my body hurt and, I just kept going back. So in relation to that, like, so I kept, when I found yoga, at first it was just kind of like exercise for me, and I was, breathing, and it made my body feel better. And then when I really started getting the breath, it sort of tickled something inside of me that led me back to the mat over and over again. So can you talk about a little bit what was tickled inside of you, I guess, that, motivated you to continue your studies?
Well, one of the things that stood out to me the most about the Bible was the book of Job. And for those of you who aren't up to date on your Bible, so there's the book of Job features this theophany moment, right, where God kind of reveals himself, and the form that he reveals himself in is like basically the voice of the whirlwind, right? So not like a friendly face, not this approachable personality, but this unstoppable force of creation and nature, which is just as chaotic and destructive as it is anything else. And in fact, the word we would use to describe it is divine violence. And in the Bhagavad Gita, there's kind of a similar moment where Arjuna asks his friend, his mentor, and as he comes to find out, his actual supreme God to show his true form. And in Greek mythology, a lot of the times when this happens, like Zeus has a lover who's like, show me your true form. No, really, show me your true form. And she won't let him alone until he's like, all right, fine. And then her head explodes and she catches on fire. And it's generally not something mortals are supposed to be able to stand, right? But Arjuna, maybe because he's semi-divine in origin himself, right? Like Indra is his father, Indra being kind of the sort of similar to Zeus in the Hindu pantheon. But he gets to behold Krishna's final form, which is this very terrible, very some of the passages that stand out is Arjuna's describing what he sees. And he says, oh, I see both of the armies on both sides of this battle, because it takes place during this, on the eve of this big, gigantic, catastrophic battle. He says, I see both of the armies rushing into your mouth, and you're consuming everyone. And not just the armies on the battlefield, but all time. He's the ultimate destination and doom for everything. But that this is what we would call a sublime moment, right? It's at face value, it's horrific, but in context to kind of the universal everythingness of it, it's actually it's a transcendently dimension expanding moment, right? So it's not just oh, everything is doomed, isn't that shitty? It's more like we're seeing the universe and its expansions and its contractions at a macro level and even at a micro level. So if you could imagine seeing all the stars rushing into a black hole at once, but then also seeing all the teeny tiny little insects on each of those stars. So if you can conceptualize an image like that, it's something along the lines of what Arjuna is describing that he sees in Krishna's universal form as the supreme being of the universe. So I just thought that was a really beautiful and honest kind of description of what a supreme being of the universe would be, rather than someone who necessarily wants to do you favors or give you good luck or anything like that. Maybe he might have love for you, but if you approach it with a purely human conception of love, you're probably going to miss the mark. So I think that's one of the things that stood out to me about it, but also just the fact that in the Bhagavad Gita, there's in context to without launching into a full lecture about it, in context of the time that it was written, a lot of these Hindu priestly class people, right? They would be, it's a caste stratified society, meaning there's sort of classes of people with specific kinds of jobs, and some are on top, some are on bottom. So the priestly class is on top, the Brahmins, right? That they live in poverty, but they have the most respect and the most subtle power in that society, right? But at the time that the Bhagavad Gita was written, they were kind of losing a lot of their influence because people were turning to Buddhism and they were turning to Jainism and some other competing kind of spiritual ideas, right? And the Bhagavad Gita came out around this time as an alternative to a lot of these different paths, which were kind of renouncing the world and saying, oh no, the real spiritual way is to basically go be a hermit and slough off the world like a snake shedding its skin. And the Bhagavad Gita says, okay, look, no, that's a false dichotomy. You can be both spiritual and have some involvement in the world. And we're going to give you at least 4 distinct paths that you can try, even though wink, wink, nudge, nudge, we happen to think one of them is the best, but they're all valid. It was more of an honest answer or palatable answer than a lot of the other spiritual paths that even at that young age I was exposed to.
Yeah, that's really interesting to me, especially because you had a background in Catholicism. Yes. Yeah. So as you said, recovering Catholic.
Yeah.
But the complexity, your acceptance of the complexity of the universe and your acceptance of the complexity of humans. I think that caused me to have a lot of healing since I've been with you. And I feel like you offer that to our students.
Okay.
Maybe this is something that we haven't discussed, but you are a truth seer, like how I am. And I'm getting teary-eyed. It'll pick it up on the video, but maybe not here. Okay. Just your ability to see truth and accept it, and a bit more from a Shiva standpoint. He'll hang out with goblins and he'll hang out with the devas, and he's kind of like it's neutral to him. But I feel like you have some of that aspect about you, like you embrace the complexities of life.
Thank you. Okay, well, for Catholics, it's not actually that much of a leap, or at least it shouldn't be, because they already believe in an essential contradiction that three things can be one, right? The Trinity being like, it's not three distinct things, it's actually three things that are also one, right? So if you can get past that hump, which is required to be a faithful Catholic, then you already kind of have that same technology to say, okay, that the universe might not be split into Aristotelian two-value logic, meaning something is either true or not. It's either one thing or it's not. There can be such a thing as plurality. Things can be many things at once. So whether we're talking about like subtle universal substances or whether we're talking about human beings, right? Like someone doesn't have to be a hero or a villain. They can be a human. Someone doesn't have to be the good guy or a bad guy of a situation, or the good girl or the bad girl of the situation. They're just in a situation, and there's another person in a situation with them. And when you broaden that view even more, we're all in this chaotic situation. But yeah, people do tend to look for simple answers to complex things.
Yeah, they do.
And they also tend to look for pleasant answers when sometimes the truth isn't pleasant.
Yeah.
And just because you say unpleasant truth, it doesn't mean you're the party bummer or that you should be ashamed of that. Like, you know, we can get political about that, but I don't think that's what this podcast is about.
Let's veer away from that. But I mean, that's very valuable for example, for my students when I give them feedback after their teaching. You know, it's not, and I can see, I know which of my students have their defenses up and which of them, you know, are battling maybe with some self-worth stuff, insecurity, because the nature of my teacher training program is more of a transformational life course, because we don't just do yoga together. I get to see them in so many different aspects, and I want to see the wholeness of them so that I can point out these truths. I try to do it in a compassionate way. I think I do. But, you know, it's like, okay, these are your strengths as far as what you bring to the table that you're very comfortable in. And these are some things that I see that you might not see. And pulling out potentiality, I see you do that with your martial arts students as well.
Thank you.
You know, yeah. So, you know, I think it's good that we see truth in each other. But I just got to one of my questions of like 8.
All right. Okay.
Moving on, but good conversation. So I wanted to ask you, just because I feel, and let me just preface this by saying, I had my first Indian national in my last yoga teacher training. Her name was Ruchi. I actually had her on podcast. You may have listened to that podcast. And it was like very important for me, you know, and I wanted feedback from her. You know, I am a white woman teaching an art from India, you know, that originated in India. And, you know, I wanted to make sure that I was honoring, that I wasn't appropriating. You know, I think that we, in my program, in our program, do a pretty good job of encompassing everything. But I wanted to know your perspective as far as why you think it's important for yoga teachers, you know, in their training to know about the history and sacred texts of India. Why is that important?
Well, there's lots of different answers for that, but I'll start with one simple one. Sometimes when you learn the history of a subject that you're interested in, or even like, let's forget about yoga for a second. Let's use a different example. So if you like, martial arts has a lot of things in common with yoga. It's an embodied practice, right? It has several different kind of origins and all that. But if we can, since yoga is also a sacred activity, there can be some sensitivities about some things that are said or not said about it, which is why I'm kind of switching to martial arts for a moment. Okay. Partially to stay out of trouble. So with martial arts, there's a lot of conjecture with like traditional martial arts, like people saying, why are you doing jump kicks? That's a strange thing to do. Or why are you blocking things like this? Why are you blocking them like that? When you look at the context of the modern world and you look at the way that people did things that are rooted in a tradition at a different historical moment, it gives you a different context as to why it's done that way. And in some cases, maybe even whether it should continue to be done that way. So for like, this is actually an apocryphal example, meaning I think it's dubious, and I personally don't think it's true, but a historical claim that'll get made all the time about like, oh, why does one martial art do jump kicks? They'll say, oh, it's because they were trying to unhorse someone, Like they were trying to jump up to someone on horseback and kick them off because otherwise they would get, rode down and lanced or whatever. Even though I think that's a funny example because there's a lot of debate about that, and I personally don't think it's true. But the greater point is like when you look at the historical circumstances that a practice evolved, and then you look at the different claims that are made about that practice, sometimes you'll find ones that don't agree. And you'll be like, am I really doing this part of this practice for the right reason? Or does it turn out that one of the reasons that I should be doing it this way and not another way is actually outdated or maybe even incorrect or wrong, right?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of the yogic sacred texts, like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, they talk about practices that are not appropriate anymore, really. And honestly, some of the texts also like have a taste of sex. In fact, a lot of them are very sexist too. So, but our consciousness has shifted. So I understand what you're saying.
So yeah, and I use the sensitivity here because it's a sacred activity for a lot of people, and I think it should be, but the way you view the substance of that sacredness it's going to be very different from person to person. And to some people, it's going to be like, no, it's absolutely perfectly conceived from the moment it was around till the end of time, and it's never going to change, and it never did change, and it was always like this. And I think there's zero chance that that's true about almost any of these practices personally, but if you accept the fact that these are things that change over time, and even in the case of modern yoga, like when you look at the history, you see that there were external forces that, like for example, as horrible as British colonialism was, and it was an absolute disaster for India. Like we should talk about it as often as we do the Holocaust, in my opinion. But anyway, there's British military exercises made their way into yoga. So people like modern day yoga practitioners actually looked at some of that stuff. And since there's two ways to look at that either A, that takes something away from yoga because it's like, oh, that makes it seem less of a sacred or divine substance perfectly handed over to mankind. Or it's a way of saying, no, yoga is a living thing, and it was always supposed to be a living thing that adapts and absorbs things and makes it its own and
that would be very
strengthens
Hindu.
it. Yeah, and that's another. So to answer your question even further, why should people learn about the history of it in the sacred texts? Because the more you learn about all that stuff, the more you learn about how dense the recipe is and how adaptable it's been over time. But also, it helps you kind of sort certain parts of it in a meaningful but also a useful way. So if you do suddenly realize that it's not just a stretchy exercise for you, and you feel these spiritual experiences from it that are very strong and very powerful, there are pathways that all these different things that led into the origin of modern day yoga, where it'll give you an expanded vocabulary, not just so you can talk about it. When I mean expanded vocabulary, I mean even ways for you to internally understand it yourself that allow you to expand those experiences.
Yep. That's absolutely. When I remember my first yoga teacher training, when my teacher would, I think she was like reading things from one of the spiritual texts. I don't know which one because I was such a new, but it spoke to my heart, and I didn't even know how to describe. I was just getting familiar with God's space within me. I touched it a few times, but I hadn't accepted it as part of me and embodied it really and lived through it and served from it. And so, having that stepping stone, when the student is ready, the teacher appears type of thing.
Yeah.
And so having these kind of like, okay, yeah, now you're starting to have these feelings, which, by the way, a lot of people who enter my yoga teacher training either come to that point where they have that yearning for this deeper understanding of yoga and thus themselves, or they're seeking some really deep healing from wounds. There's other reasons that people come, but a lot of times, like those are the two main ones. So having a knowledge base of teachers around you to surround you. So even though some of the information might not be absorbed right? Like I'm addressing a malabsorption issue that I've had for years, which I'm going to talk about in another podcast. But when they're ready to absorb it, having it ready for them, and maybe they have actually absorbed it. And you taught me this. Sometimes when you're on the path of martial arts or yoga, like things are going to be presented to you, and it took you a while to assimilate it. And then all of a sudden you have this knowledge. You don't know where it came from. But then you remember, oh, that's right. My teacher taught this to me a long time ago. And now I'm in the point where I can activate that piece within me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's a good example.
Thanks.
And so, guys, hang with me here. I'm going to keep bringing it back to martial arts only because sometimes when you look too closely at a subject that you are talking about, like yoga, it's easy to just be a self-contained spiral where you don't really get... Sometimes looking from the outside in helps a little bit, right? So another outside in example using martial arts as kind of like an analog. I would learn things at a seminar that I attended once, like one technique at one seminar, and forget about it for literally over a decade. And then I'd be training somewhere else with other people, and that thing would just automatically come out of my body, even though I only trained it once for like a minute. And that's not anything cool about me individually. That's the body remembers things that the mind doesn't a lot of the time, which is why embodied practices like yoga and martial arts are very profound, because it's a different mode of knowing. And, there's, particularly when you learn more about trauma and PTSD and these things, which if you go on the yoga journey long enough, you'll end up knocking at the door of a lot of these topics too.
In my training, you do for sure.
Yeah, but there's a book on that topic, The Body Keeps the Score, right? And the title kind of tells it all. There's things that your body remembers about your experience for better or worse. And sometimes it is for worse, in fact, and you have to kind of unpack it later. But the body keeps the score. It remembers it. Even when you we have defense mechanisms intellectually where our intellectualized memories or our cognitively wrapped up memories can actually omit themselves. And for cognitive performance, it's actually better if that we have that feature, because it's like you're making room for other stronger connections that you use more often and all that kind of thing. But body memories don't necessarily work that way in my experience. And some of the literature out there supports that. It's like a different, it's very like remembering your periodic table of elements is a very different form of recall than remembering an embodied technique or practice. So also with emotions and experiences, like that's another thing that yoga brings out in that neighborhood is you'll have emotions and this is something that Erin in her coaching does with a lot of people, and in the YTT, like these are all things that end up happening visibly, right? Like feelings, experiences, emotions will get imprinted in that body, just like this is an example that'll probably date me. Like, I don't know who still has vinyl records. I know everyone has MP3s these days.
We do.
But like a vinyl record is made because a vibration is scratched into it. It's imprinted into it. And then it's replayed later when something similar to the surface that made the etching extracts it. Right?
Ooh, can you repeat that one more time? I want everybody to listen to this because that's really good.
Sure. So the same kind of technique that imprints a signal into a vinyl record to be replayed later is that it's similar to the same impression that needs to be made to bring it back out and amplify it. So what makes the sound in the record is similar to the thing that brings the sound back out when it's played. So, I mean, you can explore that metaphor for your own traumas, your own experience. And it doesn't just have to be traumas. It could be like deep, good experiences that got trapped in there too somewhere. So.
Yeah, I definitely have giggles and, as much as I have anger and things that like come out as, just certain times like, oh, God, why did I get angry about that? Or like, why is that so fucking funny?
Yeah.
Like the Yoda voice.
And we could take this even further. We don't probably have time in this podcast for that. But when you get into the idea of epigenetic memory, like things that, meaning like outside of your genes, things in your environment, imprinting information in you, like cell deep, that's a thing. But also like even some of your ancestral memory, like that's your DNA and your RNA as a source of ancestral memory, like that same record player analogy. Like if you spend enough time thinking about that, you'll end up bumping up against that concept too. And sometimes yoga, in my opinion, brings some of that stuff out too. Things that you didn't even directly experience.
Oh, I agree. My friend Nicole, who I I keep talking about it. I'll have her on the podcast, and I will. But she is very much into that world. And we did a ceremony at her place with some shamans. And she was talking about how she was pretty sure something that I was processing was ancestral. And it just felt like truth. And I definitely believed her. So
yeah, that sounds like woo-woo crap to me in most of the walks of life that I've been around these concepts. But the longer I stick around in stuff like yoga, the more I'm like, no, there's something to that.
Oh, so that's my baby.
Yeah, and I don't think it's mystical, strange, whatever. I think there's science behind it.
I agree. So speaking of science and woo, actually, I'm going to go to a different question that I was going to ask, and I'm going to circle back around. Okay. But what was because you have the perspective of being both the student in yoga teacher training, and then specifically the Thrive one, and then also being a teacher, right? Because, yeah, you're fancy like that. So can you tell me what was your favorite part about yoga teacher training when you took it? And then what is your favorite part about it now that you are one of the professors?
Well, there's a lot of, the community aspect is nice because you bond with a whole room full of people. For me, it was a room full of people that were mostly strangers. I knew like one or two of them,
yeah, excluding
you. So that was nice. All of a sudden, you get a real deep connection to all those people. And at the time that I went through your training, the only asana that I'd really done consistently in any way is just stuff that was specifically actually what I learned in martial arts, because Rickson Gracie, the jiu-jitsu all-time hero, according to most people's reckoning, he was a yogi and he was a devoted yogi. And a lot of his practices, which I learned at one of his seminars when I was a teenager, like a lot of his asana, he didn't say the word asana, he didn't do all that. And the breathing techniques, he didn't call it yogic, but
it was.
All of it was.
Yeah.
So that was my foundation and that was my baseline. But it was like a pretty repetitive and limited set of tools. So like I could get real deep in pigeon poses and I could get real deep in these like spinal rotations and stuff like that and hip openers, because it was all good for jiu-jitsu. But when I did yoga teacher training, it was like going from the Cliff Notes to the encyclopedia. So I was like way, way, way in over my head with a lot of that stuff, but it was good. And the more common core relationships between all those different asanas I experienced, the less inexplicable it was. Meaning like, you can make the argument that a lot of these asanas at their core, they're not quite interchangeable with other ones, but they have so much in common in them that you can kind of like categorize them, and even ways apart from like classical categorization or like post-classical categorization. Like, Anusara has their own little categorization scheme that's not quite like ancient text material, I don't think, just from the limited amount of time that I've been in there.
Non-dualistic tantra based, right? So a lot of the classical is very dualistic.
So yeah, but my point is like there's all these systems that have their own categorization, but like all these different systems of yoga, particularly modernized yoga, like they have their own ways of categorizing it, but you also internally end up experiencing a common core yourself, where maybe you couldn't instantly map it out, but like your body seems to understand like, oh, there's so much in common with this pose, with this other one, and maybe this other one, and this one. Like your body can be a little bit wiser than you are rationally, if you know what I mean, about some of that stuff. So,
and being a professor for I guess what I'm asking is flipping that role to where you get to see the students grow and change, especially this last year was, an interesting special year as far as, we had to take 2 of our modules online, which I did not want to do, but, like trying to, just from the perspective of like yoga is something that you experience. It's very hard to convey all the energy and power and magic through Zoom. But, being in that flip role and kind of seeing the students change and grow.
I don't think this is going to exactly answer your question, and I'm being a pain in the butt. I'm sorry. But as far as like my similarities from when I was a teacher or student to a teacher, one of my favorite things about it was, aside from getting a deeper understanding of all the asana, like I liked when we were discussing the stories and the texts, partially because I could contribute to it, not in a way where I was trying to be obnoxious, like, excuse me, like more just like it's nice when people collectively talk about those things. But as an instructor, I actually have kind of an unfair-ish standard that that's one of my biggest experiences as an instructor, is basically me thinking like, this whole room full of students has a lifetime of learning of some of the materials that I'm personally teaching them. And I'm excited for the ones who can bite into it. And I'm a little bittersweet about the ones who I feel like don't get that part. And I don't know if that's fair to say. It sounds negative, but what I'm saying is like, yoga is a profound thing in and of itself. Even if you just do asana, even if you're just getting like stretchy exercise, you'll get a lot of bonus parts of that experience that you didn't really like go after by name. But I really would prefer that when people see that I'm giving them the fire hose of information, like, hey, here's the history of these intellectual ideas, here's the texts, here's the stories, that the takeaway that they get from it isn't like, oh, I'm not going to remember any of this. But it's more like the takeaway I want from them to get from it is, this is an entire life ahead of me of learning about this stuff, and it's something that I should do.
Yes.
So it's because it's not just about stretchy workout. And I kind of touched on this in one of my earlier answers, but it gives you a greater context. It expands your understanding. It even expands your understanding of the asana that you're doing. So like just a literal example I can give is, if you talk about warrior poses, this is actually something that I've done several times recently at the beach yoga. I'm like, okay, guys, when you learn about the history of yoga, if you ever do, one day you're going to learn that different people did yoga in different ways. And guess what? There's a warrior class, the Kshatriyas, who did yoga in a pretty specific way. So when we're talking about these warrior poses, let's understand this one. They were probably firing a volley of arrows. This one, they were probably smiting their enemy. So like in terms of saying like, oh, make sure your base can accommodate that. Like you want your base to be solid enough where if you had to come and chop someone with an axe, it's a very funny image, but like, or if you had to take a gigantic long bow and fire a volley of arrows into like the army all the way over there, your base should feel like it could accommodate that. So even just at that very literal level, like I wouldn't have had that perspective if I didn't go hunting for the information, right? So that's even at just that very literal level, like it repays. It really does repay. So in terms of when I was a student, when I got to be the teacher, that's probably one of the parts I got to appreciate most. And also what I wanted to kind of put back into the system most is to create more of a sense of urgency of like, go look this stuff up. I'm just giving you an index. You're not going to remember everything I'm saying. Don't get stressed out.
Yeah. I'll
give you a cheat sheet for the test, but go look this stuff up. Start a lifelong journey now. It rewards itself several times over.
That's I just want to say I appreciate your perspective so much, and I think like Diana, who I had on the podcast recently, like absolutely adores you and the way that you share. You're saying that to all the yoga professors.
She's a sweetie.
She is a sweetie. But I think she adores you so much because she can tell that is what you're doing for everyone, and that's besides your impressive encyclopedia of knowledge about like Vedic texts, the fact that you embody it and you can tell that you present it in a way that would encourage that life path, and you speak very sincerely. And by the way, this is so interesting of a podcast that this is probably going to be a two-parter. Just going to say that. Hopefully that's okay.
Sure.
So I'm really digging this.
Okay.
And it's rare that I have two-part podcasts, but with people I really like.
Woohoo.